We're working on First Thessalonians, the fifth chapter, verses 1 through 11 today. Welcome back. I'm glad you're with us. Let's jump right in. Uh, verse 1. Now, concerning the times and the seasons, brothers and sisters, you do not need to have anything written to you. So, concerning the times and seasons, this is a reference to last week's lesson, chapter 4. If you remember last week's lesson, it was a pretty famous text, a proof text for people who uh, buy into the idea of rapture and that kind of end time scenario made popular by the Left Behind books. It seems like Paul's gotten a question from Timothy about that the Thessalonians had as far as if Jesus is going to come, what happens to people who die before Jesus comes? And so part of the teaching of First Thessalonians is don't worry about this. God's got this. And at the end of time, Jesus will come and he will take those from the dead and resurrect them from the grave. And he will take you who are alive and you'll all come into one big pot of goodness. Is kind of what the fourth chapter said. And now in the fifth chapter, he's going to address when exactly that'll happen. A couple things to keep in mind is one, Paul's a pre-modern person, and he thinks pretty linear. He thinks pretty linear for time too, especially. And that's what Scripture is going to represent too, the sense that the time begins in one spot and it ends in another spot, which is really how everyone's thought up until the last 100 years or so when Einstein had a theory of relativity, and physicists since have started to poke on this idea of time, and that it might be a little more complicated than that. But for Paul, he's looking for an end of this age, and a new sort of time to start, and that'll be a specific date, and God knows that specific date, and it's been a cottage industry in Paul's day, and it's a cottage industry in our day to try to think about when that date will be. And that sort of literature has been called apocalyptic literature, which is apocalyptic just means end times, and the sense, and it's literature that's focused on the end of time. And usually apocalyptic literature is popular in a culture when that culture feels persecuted. And so in Jesus's day, in Paul's day, apocalyptic literature was a very popular Jewish form of writing. The Qumran Society had apocalyptic literature that was part of them. Daniel, and which is an apocalyptic book of the Old Testament, was written. One of the last books written in the Old Testament is that kind of intertestamental time, because Jewish people felt so under siege with Roman control. And so whenever a culture feels like they're under siege, apocalyptic literature is good because it gives you hope, and that's what it's meant to do. It says times might be bad right now, but don't worry, they will be better. God's got this handled. Trust God in the midst of this. And so that's what verse 5 is, or chapter 5 is going to say as we continue here, that God's got this, but it's going to get better. Now, as we go on now, Paul's going to take 3, even 4 different metaphors and kind of pile them on top of each other. I've been telling the classes that I've been teaching this. This is definitely something that's read in the midst of a Sunday morning from the lector, and you've lost track 2-3 verses in, and you start watching the baby in front of you, or judging the clothes of your neighbor to the side of you, because you aren't paying attention any longer. Because it's hard just to hear the scripture and to pay attention. If you got a Bible at home, I would encourage you to open up that Bible as we go through this, pretty much verse by verse, these 11 verses, and we'll go through it slowly, and hopefully by the end of it you'll have a good sense overall of what Paul's trying to say in this 5th chapter. Let's go on to verse 2. For you yourselves know very well that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. So this day of the Lord is at end time, right? The world began, the world ends. the resurrection begins and this new creation happens. You can all picture that in your mind. And the first image he uses to describe when that'll be is a thief in the night. Now, if you are hanging around the Bible a lot, this would be a familiar term. If you're Christian, which I assume you are, this would be something that you would understand right away as a teaching of Jesus. Scholars get kind of excited about that sort of stuff. The unusual thing about Paul is he's built all these churches around Jesus, but really about the only thing he ever says about Jesus is that he died and was resurrected. He doesn't give us any of his parables. He doesn't give us any of his wisdom teachings. He doesn't give us any, the great Sermon on the Mount or anything like that. And the belief is that surely Paul taught these churches that were gathered around this crucified Messiah. Surely he taught them what Jesus taught in his teachings too. And so when we have kind of a direct reference, Jesus uses this thief of the night reference himself. Scholars think, you see, there was probably some sort of booklet of Jesus' teachings that each one of these churches were left behind. And this might have been a familiar teaching in that booklet. The idea that scholars have not proven, they've never found anything like this, is that all these early churches had booklets maybe of parables and booklets of miracles and booklets of wisdom teachings from Jesus. And when the Gospels were put together, they were put together by disciples or by disciples of disciples who used those booklets to kind of piece together a narrative of Jesus from birth until death and resurrection. So, but if you're a Jewish scholar, you're going to say, wait a minute, a thief in the night's also in the Old Testament. It's a prophetic language too. So Jesus, when he used it, was using prophetic language, and Paul, who is definitely someone familiar with the prophets, could just as easily been referencing prophetic language with a thief in the night. Regardless, let's poke at the metaphor a little bit. When we hear that the end of time is going to be a thief in the night, what is that metaphor trying to tell us about when the end of time will be? That's the question we need to be asking. And I think thief and night are the two words to hone in on. So a thief comes at an unexpected hour. It would be a pretty stupid thief that calls you up and says, I'm going to come and rob you at 2 a.m., right? No thief does that. A thief comes when you're not expecting it. And so the end of time will come at an unexpected hour. And then night. Of course, a thief comes at night because a thief is evil and evil things happen in the night. The end of time isn't evil, but the world that you live in is evil. It is kind of what this night image is about. You're going to feel put upon by the world. Remember I said that this apocalyptic literature was especially popular when people were being persecuted. So just this sense that the world's going to hell in a handbasket, that's kind of night talk. Bad things happen in night. The devil is the prince of darkness, we say, because he lurks in the night. At night, you can't see clearly. You're not at your best at night. And also at night, you sleep. You're not paying attention. That's why thief comes at night. So the end of time will happen when you least expect it and when the world seems at its worst, is what this first metaphor says. Let's read on. Verse 3. When they say there is peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them, as labor pains came upon a pregnant woman, and there will be no escape. So the second metaphor to describe this end of time is labor pains. And labor pains, again, is used often in prophetic language, and also Jesus uses labor pains. And so labor pains to describe this end of time is important. Think about labor pains, right? For one thing, they are hard and intense, and then it's peaceful. And it's hard and intense, and then it's peaceful. And isn't that sort of how our broken world feels hard, horrible, and we're never going to get out of this, and then it's peaceful. Horrible, we're never going to get out of this, and it's peaceful. Um, and that's what verse 3 says. There's peace and security, and then sudden destruction. That's what a labor pain is, right? Uh, but where does a labor pain lead us? That's the key to this end of time. It leads us to a new creation. It leads us to something wonderful. It makes all that pain purposeful, right? Oh, that pain was worth it because I've gotten to this spot, this beautiful baby that I'm holding now. That pain was worth it because it's gotten me to this spot, this new creation. And also in labor pain, it says there will be no escape. So the last piece for this metaphor is that you can't change the situation of your world. You can only endure it and respond to it as faithfully as possible. You can't change it. You can only endure it and respond to it as faithfully as possible. Verse 4. But you, beloved, are not in darkness, for that day to surprise you like a thief. For you are all children of light and children of the day. We are not of the night or of darkness. So now we refer to that thief in the night image again. And the thief in the night is that you aren't in darkness. That thief can't ever surprise you because you are always living in daylight. Darkness doesn't exists for you. Okay, now we're talking metaphor here because obviously darkness exists for you. But the reason darkness doesn't exist for you is because you are not of darkness. Remember we said darkness is a sign of evil, and you are not of evil, the prince of darkness, we said, right? You are a child of light. You are a son of light. In fact, the Greek word that we've translated as children in the NRSV is actually son. And the NRSV chose children to make it inclusive language, so non-gendered language, which is usually a good idea. In the first verse that we read, it said brothers and sisters, and the Greek only said brothers, but the intent is brothers and sisters. So that's a good translation to help make sure people realize that all are included in this invitation. Maybe the problem with children used in verse 5 is that it does say sons, and in Paul's day, a son has a very specific responsibility, and that responsibility is to emulate the father. Does that make sense? You became a carpenter because your dad was a carpenter. You didn't come to your dad and say, "Dad, I'd rather grow flowers and become a carpenter." Your dad would see that as a great and shameful thing. What? I'm not a good enough. It's not good enough for you to be a carpenter like I am, and like your grandfather was, and like his father was before him. Right? I mean, you are bringing dishonor if you don't emulate your father, if you don't become like your father, because by becoming like your father, you're saying your father is worthy to follow. Your father is worthy to emulate. So who you are like is who your father is. And in the same token, if you do something horrible in the community that brings shame upon you, you don't just bring shame upon yourself, you bring shame upon your father, because the same thing works, right? You must be acting like your father. The shameful thing you did must be a shameful sort of thing that your father does. And so you are showing your father's brokenness when you show your own brokenness in the community. All this is to say is who we are in the world, how we act in the world, in Paul's day especially, represents who our Father is. And so Paul's using this son of light metaphor to tell us that you are a son of God. And for a son of God, there is no darkness because you were always in the light of God's love. And so you never need to feel afraid in the darkness or to feel like you're going to be overcome by that darkness. And that, in the same token, you aren't to act like you're influenced by evil because you aren't a son of evil. You aren't a son of darkness. So verse 6. So then, let us not fall asleep as others do, but let us keep awake and be sober. For those who sleep, sleep at night, and those who are drunk, get drunk at night. So let us not fall asleep as others do, but let us keep awake and be sober. So this is the point of this, is that you need you need to be in the light. There's no darkness that exists for you. So there's no reason for you to sleep. There's never a time for you to sleep. Again, we're talking about metaphor here. So Paul expects you to sleep at night, and Paul expects you to get drunk probably at times too. But the drunken metaphor, the sleep metaphor means uh, that you are to be awake and alert. Evil can overcome you if you fall asleep, if you aren't paying attention, if you aren't awake and alert. That's when you can be taken advantage of in this world. And if you don't have your wits about you, that's that drunkenness. If you're not clear-headed, if you're not secure in the word, because your head's bobbled or moggled or something like that. So you need to live in the light always, um, and to be ready. Uh, a story I've been telling this week when I've been teaching this is that when I was 17, a senior in high school, some kids in my school started egging my house, and they egged my house the first time on a Friday night, sometime after midnight, and then they egged my house the very next Friday again, sometime after midnight. And so the third Friday night, my father made me stay up with him, and we hid in the living room in the darkness, holding bats. I don't know why my dad thought holding bats was a good idea to to respond to these high school kids, but that's what we did. And sure enough, around 1 in the morning, they pulled into our driveway, and we came running out with bats. Okay, so we knew that evil was lurking in that story, and we stayed awake and were ready for him and to respond appropriately. Evil's lurking around you, so you need to stay awake and be ready for it. Don't let your guard down. Don't be tempted, would be the word we might use. Okay? Verse 8. But since we belong to the day, let us be sober and put on the breastplate of faith and love, and for a helmet, the hope of salvation. Now we have a fourth metaphor, this idea of armor of God. And if you are a Paul scholar, you know that this armor of God is something that Paul uses several times in his letters. And then he breaks it all out in Ephesians, and we get a full uniform in Ephesians. But here we just get a couple pieces of that armor: breastplate of faith and love, and a helmet of hope and salvation. Faith and love and hope of salvation all have already come up in the first 4 chapters of First Thessalonians, and when Paul mentions them, they're always something you strive for and work at. And I think that's important to say, because faith, love, and hope feel like touchy-feely, sort of ephemeral things that you can't really grab onto. But for Paul, they're the work of the work of our religious life. Okay, I think it's a labor of love and a work of faith and a steadfastness of hope, is how Paul describes those 3 things earlier in First Thessalonians. That faith is an undeserved gift from God, is what we believe as Christians. But to live out your faith, you work out your faith with fear and trembling, Paul says in First Thessalonians. You're constantly unpacking your faith and challenging what you believe, or being challenged in what you believe, and coming to a new understanding of that. Love isn't just a heart feeling for someone else. Love is work towards your neighbor of sacrifice and humbleness, that we read about in First Thessalonians. Um, It's an action towards your neighbor, a labor of love, he says. And hope, there's things that are constantly taking away your hope in this world. And so the hope is steadfastness in order to keep on to it. That means you got to be committed to hoping, to in the worst situations, know that God's got something better planned. I've been with people right after they've done hard or bad things. Their brokenness is vulnerable and raw in the world. And what I always counsel them is that God does not know you by your worst actions. You know, that somehow you need to see beyond how bad you feel and ashamed you feel today, and remind yourself what God sees in you and what God's promised for you. Similarly, in this, there's a wonderful YouTube moment of children, teenagers who are homosexual and being bullied in school, and older gay men and women are making clips telling them it's going to get better. I think, and I think that's the hashtag for those YouTube clips. It gets better. This kind of hope that you're in the midst of bad stuff now, but God has got good things planned for you. There's a steadfastness to that. In and then if you step back maybe 10,000 feet from this metaphor of armor of God that protects us in the world, the reality is that darkness and evil have real ways to hurt us, and the things that protect us aren't really things that protect our physical self. Uh, which is a reminder that Jesus died on the cross, right? If someone if someone has an intention to violently hurt us, you know, hit us over the head with a mallet, a helmet of hope isn't going to protect us from not getting our head bashed in, but it is going to protect us from having that head bashed in being the last word about who we are. So, so it's a good reminder, as we have crusaders of the faith in today's language, where they're taking up guns to protect themselves in the church because of intruders that have ill will towards them, or back in the Middle Ages, where they took up swords and shields and conquered the Holy Land for Jesus. That sort of armor is never what God has intent. Our God who revealed himself in Jesus, who said, turn the other cheek when someone has violent intent. Verse 9. For God has destined us not for wrath, but for obtaining salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us, so that whether we are awake or asleep, we may live with him. So 9 and 10 there. God has not destined us for wrath. This is a judgment teaching. This idea, we say it in our Apostles' Creed. Now, it just left me real quick. He will come again to judge the living and the dead, is what we say in the Apostles' Creed. When Jesus comes, this cloud image that's in chapter 4, when Jesus comes at this end of time that we are hopeful and expecting, the thing that Jesus is going to do is he's going to judge us, the living and the dead. We have images of in Matthew of separating the well, I'm going to get it wrong, goats and sheep, I think is what it is, maybe, and chaff and wheat, and some parables, this separation. And we should feel uneasy about judgment. Judgment does not sound like a good thing. Judgment is rarely a good thing. And if we're honest with ourselves, we know that if we got judged, we would have all sorts of things to be accounted for. I want to share with you what I read in a Scholar this week that reminds us that for Jewish Paul, the day of judgment wasn't a day where he had to go through all of the horrible things he did in this world and have God weigh them to see whether he had more good things than bad things. We know that for sure because Paul strikes that one down and says, you've been made good by Jesus. It doesn't matter how many good and bad things you have. but also just these particular sins, that you're going to have to account for at the end of time. Um, that's not really a Jewish idea. The Jewish idea is that there's this one massive God, uh, surrounded by cultures that believed in all sorts of gods. The Jewish people said kind of uh, uniquely, no, there's just one God, but that God is huge and all powerful and awesome. And the lifeblood of that God is goodness. So it's this one massive goodness of God. And the Jewish idea is that God is so good, so bright, right? To use that image of a sun, that anytime that God gets near anything that's broken or bad or evil, it it is repelled by God, like two magnets that can't come together. We can't approach God because the brokenness in us is repellent to God. Even if God wanted to embrace us, the Jewish idea is God couldn't unless God in some way gets that brokenness out of us. And the Jewish idea is that brokenness is refined from us, that God is this powerful heat of goodness. And when we approach God, all the badness in us is burned off. And so hopefully all the badness in you is burned off and there's still some goodness left. That would be a Jewish idea, to be embraced by God. Well, we know in Jesus, then, what Paul adds, is that the goodness that is left, that is embraced, that you are assured that on this day of being burned by the goodness of God, there will be something left of you, because of our Lord Jesus Christ. So the wrath that God intends for anybody isn't wrath on God hating humanity or creation. It's the it's the result of God's goodness encountering the brokenness and evil in our world. So that whether we are awake or asleep, it says in verse 10, we may live with God. Um, I love whether we are awake or asleep, because if you've been paying attention, all of this is Paul saying, people, you need to stay awake. The end of time is coming and you need to be ready for it. It could come at any time. And there's going to be bad stuff that happens, but it's going to lead to something good. And you don't belong to the night, the bad stuff that happens. You belong to the good. So protect yourself. All this is about staying awake and being ready. And then in verse 10, he goes, but you might fall asleep. But you might fall asleep. That's the note of grace, people. That's the note of grace. That we know who we are supposed to be. But as Paul says in another letter, uh, in Philippians, but yet I constantly encounter who I am. So do your best knowing that you're going to fail. And don't take those failures lightly. But do have confidence that in your failures, God will forgive you. And then verse 11. Therefore, encourage one another and build up each other as indeed you are doing. For Paul, it all comes back to community. In order for us to live through a difficult life, and all of us have difficult times. All of us have times where darkness just seems to overcome us, and there's no goodness to be found. In those times when we can't see in front of us, when it doesn't feel like we have our wits about us, where we don't feel sober, we need our brother and sister who are sober, who can lead us. We need our brother and sister who can see daylight to help us get through this darkness. Faith is lived in community, because this world is just too broken to try to live it all by yourself. And so Paul, and every chance he gets, he tells these churches spread out, to rely on each other. And I tell you that today, if you aren't part of a church community, you are doing religion hard. You need a church community to live out your faith, to be encouraged in the worship, and to be encouraged by your brothers and sisters who know you and love you because you are part of their daily interaction. Thanks. I look forward to seeing you again next week. Bye-bye.